My neighbor woke me up at 4 a.m. and proposed marriage to me. The reason surprised me. I still remember the sound. The 3 hard, impatient knocks that could have been a warning or a demand. They hit the door like someone trying to wake the building itself. For a second I slept through them, wrapped in the kind of routine that has its own gravity. Alarm at 6, make coffee, spreadsheets, rinse, repeat. Then the 3rd knock cut through whatever small dream I was having, and I sat upright, heart doing that lazy, annoyed flip you get when somebody interrupts your sleep for something petty. I padded to the door in socks, the hallway light buzzing above me. The clock over the stove read 4:03. I opened the door expecting a drunk neighbor or the building manager asking me to sign something I would forget to sign. Instead, she was standing there, Adriana, only she didn't look like the Adriana I knew from the lobby, the one who always carried herself like she owned the morning and the elevator buttons. She was a mess. Her hair had escaped its usual precision. Streaks of mascara had carved small black tracks down her cheeks. Her coat was buttoned wrong, and one heel dangled from her hand like an abandoned prop. She smelled like expensive citrus and overnight, a combination that made me think, absurdly, of hotel rooms and a life that keeps midnight appointments. Up close, she looked 15 years younger than the Adriana who chaired panels downtown. Vulnerability rearranged her features into something softer, unmoored. "Garrett," she said, not knocking again, just saying my name like it mattered. Her voice had that rush to it that happens when you ask a question you're too afraid to ask. Then, before I could offer her a chair or ask if she wanted coffee, she said, flat and urgent, "Will you marry me?" The words landed like someone had thrown a suitcase at my chest. For a beat, I thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe a dare, maybe the after effects of a bad night. My mind, always quick to inventory practicalities, ran through improbable scenarios. We'd shared a laugh in the laundry room 2 months ago. She'd been kind when the elevator stalled last winter. I'd once lent her a pen. None of that suggested proposals at 4 in the morning. She looked like she needed something bigger than an explanation. Tears made her eyes shine. She reached out, palm hovering like she could touch an answer into being. "I'm serious," she said. "I can't keep doing the going out routine. I don't want it anymore. I want someone who'll pick me up at 4 in the morning." I laughed then, a small reflexive noise that was part disbelief and part the uncomfortable attempt to find a place to stand. "Adriana," I said, because names tether people. "Sit down. Tell me why you're at my door at 4 a.m. She stepped in without asking, crossed my small living room like she owned the space, and angled herself toward my tiny kitchen, the part of my apartment that is stubbornly practical. The heat from the space heater huffed warm air. Her cuff scraped my coffee table. She put her heel down and took off the other with fingers that trembled. The thing about people you think you know is that vulnerability redraws the map. She was the woman who hosted panels at the gallery, who had a profile in the local weekly saying she kept a few small companies alive, and smiled at cameras like she was practiced at trust. I had seen her at building functions, all polished edges and firm handshakes. I had never, until that moment, really seen what was under the polish. Over a pot of coffee, which I made with the automatic thrift of someone who counts cups like one counts columns, she told me about the series of small failures that had landed her in my doorway. Not grand betrayals or a cinematic collapse, just a string of evenings that had crept into a hollow, an empty restaurant table here, an absent text there, nights where laughter came cheap and company did not. She'd been to events that required ratings and speech notes. She'd been excellent at being admired. Privately, she was exhausted of the script. "I haven't had a night where I could be that messy in front of someone in a long time," she said, voice breaking on messy, like it was a secret she'd been keeping from herself. There was a vulnerability that rarely shows itself to strangers, only to the ones you can imagine letting breathe. That night, she let it out. She cried into the ceramic mug I thrust toward her, and I held the pot while she steadied herself on the counter. There were no fireworks, no bombs to defuse, just a single jagged line of truth. She was lonely, and she thought marriage might be an answer. It would have been easier to treat her like a project. I could have assessed the mess with accountant's detachment, liabilities, assets, compatibility percentages. I could have folded her openness into a spreadsheet labeled potential disruptions. But whatever calculations I ran against the moments we had shared in the building, fixing a stuck washer, borrowing my spare charger, the polite nods in the corridor, none of them explained what had unfolded. The proposal, rash as it was, felt more like a plea than a plan. "Why me?" I asked, because the whole thing sat atop the practical. She looked at me like I had asked the only sensible question in the world. "Because you didn't recognize me as something to be used," she said. "Because when you look at me, you don't see the chair I'm supposed to sit in at some charity event. You see me." She laughed, which turned into a sob, into a quieter laugh again. "Because you gave me a Band-Aid once that actually fit. If that sentence had been a movie line, I'd call it overwrought and smirk. In real life, it read like a currency exchange. Kindness for vulnerability." The moment was not about heroics. It was about someone needing to be seen for the small human way she was in the dark. "I can't accept falling in love at 4 in the morning, I told her. The words were more candid than I intended, but they were truthful. "You can ask me anything, but we need to talk about what this means." She nodded like she expected the answer and had planned on it. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug as if it was an anchor. We talked until the coffee pot clicked empty and the pre-dawn light softened the edges of the room into a color I wouldn't have named if you'd asked me. She spoke in confessions. About the superficial dates that ended when the check arrived. About the security of keeping people at a measured distance. About a fear of being someone's accessory. She admitted that sometimes she felt like a professional version of herself by day and a silent, lonely person by night. "I don't want to be the headline in someone else's life," she said. "I want someone who'd find me at 4 in the morning and not expect a press release about it." There was bravery in the way she spoke, an urgency that wasn't theatrical. It was less a demand than a surrender. She offered me a glimpse of a life behind the glass towers and podiums. For a man who keeps numbers properly aligned, that glimpse was an uncalculated variable. I told her about Jennifer. It felt like only fair. In my small apartment, with the kettle cooling on the stove, the past that had shaped me seemed less like a closed file and more like a live document. Jennifer had been a neat possibility in my 20s, engaged in the way one can be engaged to a plan. We were young, we had ideas about houses and 2.5 children, and we had an altar of intentions that I thought we would build a life on. Then, in a way that proved cruelty has no forecast, she left. She left because one night she told me she wanted the city to feel different. She wanted more spontaneity, more risk. My spreadsheets could not hold her appetite for possibility. I liked the certainty of numbers, and she liked the mess of chance. We had split with an awkward civility. I went back to balance sheets and late dinners with the TV on. She wandered into creative jobs, taking an apartment closer to the river. She would occasionally tag me in something ironic on social media, an old joke revisited, and I would like the comment as if to confirm that we were still amicable. After that, I grew to like the simplicity of my life. I had friends, a brother who called on Sundays, a job that asked for little theatrics beyond punctuality. I had a slow, small contentment that did not glitter. So when Adriana asked me to marry her at 4 a.m., it touched something that was both tender and defensive. My history taught me to be cautious with promises. Her appearance at my door taught me that promises can be spoken when people are raw, and they don't always come in the tidy packages we expect. We did not make any declarations that night except to agree on the first rules of any reasonable entanglement: honesty, consent, boundaries. I asked her to explain why she felt she needed to propose in the pre-dawn. She said she didn't know. Panic, fear, a moment that culminated after a string of failed attempts at connection. She apologized for the brusqueness. She laughed apologetically, and then, more firmly, said, "I want to be honest. I could have walked away. I could have slept. But I came to your door because I wanted someone who would let me say the things nobody asked to hear." We agreed that the proposal, as raw as it was, couldn't be the contract that binds two lives. If anything, it was a key smuggled into a conversation. We would continue with curiosity. We would not rush into cohabitation or legalities. We would each decide how much of our private selves we chose to bring out into the open. Before she left, she zipped up her coat and placed a small, structured hand on my arm. Her fingers trembled less than they did when she had arrived. "I don't want to scare you," she said. "You already did," I admitted. "But I'm not running away tonight." She smiled like someone who had been awarded a small mercy. Then she turned and walked into the hallway, where the light hummed a little too bright and the elevator groaned like an old animal. I watched her go, feeling stupidly like I'd watched the last of the night disappear above her shoulders. If you're the kind of person who likes these slow-constructed stories of human missteps and mercies, this is the spot where you'd tap like or follow. It helps me know I'm not talking into a room of one. But if you only stopped for the headline, that my neighbor woke me at 4 and proposed, know this. There are layers beneath the knock, and that's the part I want to stay in. After she left, I sat on my couch with the coffee gone cold and thought about how quickly people can offer their lives to strangers. I thought about the architecture of loneliness, how it builds rooms inside of us that we only open by mistake or by design. I also thought about how ordinary my living room looked in that light, how my books leaned like small sentinels, and the plant on the sill still needed watering. The next days had the awkwardness of any beginning. We were neighbors, which meant there was a naturalness to bumping into each other. In the laundry room at odd hours, on the stoop when someone left the recycling out overnight, in the lobby where she would pass with her laptop bag angled like a briefcase and a smile that had learned to be composed. Those short interactions gave us a vocabulary. We were careful, both of us, about the appearance of impropriety. She would invite me to a charity event months later. I'd decline sometimes when my ledger wouldn't allow the kind of evening that required a tuxedo mind. There was an agreement, unspoken at first and then voiced, that our connection would begin in the neutral spaces of the city. The paper-stained tables of the grindstone, the park bench where old men threw breadcrumbs to pigeons, the Italian place on the corner with sauces that stained your napkins. It was honest to say we were testing whether the thing that had pulled us together at 4 in the morning had any purchase in daylight. Our first proper date was a Saturday afternoon coffee. She arrived with a book under her arm and a jacket that smelled faintly of citrus and linen. She apologized for the theatricality of the early morning moment with a humor that had no malice, an attempt to make the ridiculous feel human. "People think I'm all speeches and spreadsheets," she said, stirring her coffee with a spoon the way people try to keep small things steady. "Then I go home and realize I'm actually full of bad takeout and romantic movies my mother recommended." I told her I liked that she could be ridiculous. She looked at me like she had hoped I would. We talked about small things that become big in the telling, where we liked to walk, what childhood neighborhoods smelled like, whether you could ever be friends with your exes. She probed gently into what I wanted from my life, and I told her the truth. Stability, a home that didn't need daily reinvention, someone who liked burnt toast as much as I did. It was the kind of honesty that happens when two people decide to leave their masks in the coat room. We set boundaries with a seriousness that almost felt bureaucratic. Emails for work, friendship with mutual respect, conversations about privacy. There was talk about whether to tell other neighbors, about how we'd handle accidental public visible affection. She said she wanted none of the performance that her job sometimes demanded. I said I wanted my career to remain my career. At the end of that first date, we didn't kiss. That felt important. Instead, we stood on the sidewalk and watched the city move around us. People with coffee and paper cups shifted past. A bus exhaled its passengers. My hands were empty, and so were hers, which felt like permission more than denial. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That this could go badly in 100 different very sensible ways," I said. "And that I'm not sure I mind." She smiled like she knew what I meant. "Neither am I," she said. Over the next few weeks, those neutral meetings became the scaffolding of a relationship. We cooked overly complicated meals in my kitchen and then laughed at ourselves when we burned the garlic. She taught me to make a salad dressing that used lemon zest in a way that felt almost religious. I taught her how to keep a budget without using a spreadsheet as a cover for emotion. We learned each other's small rituals, how she liked the curtains drawn a certain way, how I preferred the lights low when reading. There were, of course, awkward moments. Once she nearly introduced me to someone as my neighbor, which felt perfectly accurate but oddly small when said next to the person for whom she reserved formal introductions. Another time a colleague of hers recognized her on the street and said, "Oh, Adriana, always pushing yourself." "Who's this?" She introduced me with a careful economy, and the exchange left both of us aware of the spaces social roles still occupied. We were deliberate about the calendar of our closeness. There was a meeting with my brother Ben one Sunday. I wanted him to see the person who had been at my door at 4. Ben, who has the practical way of cutting to the bone of things, asked 3 questions. "Do you sleep okay? Do you find yourself being more yourself? Are you being honest with her?" I answered honestly, which meant admitting that I didn't sleep as well, but that I thought about her in the ordinary way that people think about a favorite sweater. Comforting, sometimes frayed, but familiar. I said she made me laugh in ways I had forgotten were available to me. We had the important conversation about consent and visibility. I wanted to make sure that being neighbors didn't mean we were living under a microscope. She understood. "We don't need to be a show," she said. "I don't want my personal life to be a talking point. I want my personal life to be personal." There was also the practical recognition that people in our building have opinions and social networks. People see patterns and sometimes interpret kindness as opportunity. We agreed to informally tell a couple of close neighbors when the time felt right, not as an admission, but as a way to guard against gossip that could eat at a fragile beginning. We both had moments of watching someone in the lobby and measuring whether the look they gave us was approving or calculating. Early romance is a sport played with other people's commentary. One quiet Tuesday evening she knocked again. It was not a proposal this time. She was holding a paper bag with something that smelled faintly of garlic and tomato, left over from the corner Italian place, and she asked if she could sit. I said yes, and she slumped into the same chair she had occupied the night she arrived, like a visitor reclaiming a familiar seat. "This is ridiculous," she said, laughing into the scent of food. "It's ridiculous that I proposed to you at 4 a.m. I don't know what possessed me." "You said it was a plea," I reminded her gently. "A plea for honesty," she said. "I used to think marriage was a kind of finish line with balloons. Now I realize maybe it's just a really big daily decision." She was right. Marriage, in the sacred trash can of domestic myths, is often imagined as a final destination when, in truth, it is a repetition, choosing someone again and again. She had rushed the language, perhaps, but the sentiment, wanting to be chosen monthly, in the toothbrush drawer whisper, wasn't wrong. It was, if anything, the most ordinary kind of desire. The nights that followed were a montage of small trust exercises. We learned how to share space. Who would water the plant? Who would take the trash out? Which drawer would be used for which utensils? The act of building domestic habits felt less like fusion and more like setting a table together where each plate had its own rightful place. There were conversations about where we wanted to be in 5 years. She spoke of a slower pace, maybe consulting, maybe stepping back from the front stage that required her to be polished at all hours. I spoke of wanting a home that felt like an anchor. Neither of us offered promises we couldn't keep. We circled around, making careful notes. And then there was the quiet time, the moment when I realized the 4 a.m. proposal had not been a culmination, but an admission. It was a map point. She had found a door and knocked because she needed to know if someone would open it. I had opened it, because despite the carefulness that had defined my life after Jennifer, I could not, in that moment, needlessly close a human out. That understanding did not erase the need for caution. She had a public life that required careful boundaries. I had attachments to a kind of predictability. We agreed on check-ins, conversations where we would air discomforts or suspicions about intentions, where we'd be candid about things that worried us. It was an adult way of loving, built more like a meeting schedule than a fairy tale. Our conversations sometimes felt like work reviews, and sometimes like confessions. We were both learning to tolerate the ordinary embarrassments of intimacy. She would tell me about a speech she gave, where she found herself forgetting a line. I would tell her about the Tuesday I realized I'd been eating dinner standing at the sink for 3 nights in a row. We learned to laugh about the trivial things, and to reserve a steadier face for real trouble. On a particularly ordinary Friday, she came over with burnt toast. Burnt toast as a gesture deserves its own kind of reverence. It was the kind of domestic accident that reads like honesty. She had tried to make breakfast for me. The alarm on her stove failed her, and the bread went to charcoal. She came with the bag of slightly blackened slices and a sheepish grin. "I ruined breakfast," she said. "I thought you might like to see the real me." I took a piece, tasted the thin layer of char against the butter, and it tasted like a small offering. She watched me like she'd been practicing bravery. "Do you still consider me serious?" she asked. I smiled because that's what you do when someone offers their burnt toast as if it were a crown. "Burnt toast is honest," I said. "I'd like more honest toast." She laughed and then, with a quietness that was almost prayerful, reached across the table and said, "Garrett, I know I knocked at your door in a way that startled you. I know I used words too big for that moment. But I meant every small thing afterward. I meant the coffee, the parades of burnt toast, the stubbornness of staying. The shock of the initial knock had worn into something softer, a series of small choices that slowly suggested a life. There was still a long way to go. There were calendars to negotiate, friends to introduce, careers and public identities to reconcile with something that wanted nothing to do with spectacle. But there was also bravery in the small domesticity she offered. Burnt toast, midnight confessions, Sunday phone calls where we compared grocery lists. When she left that night, she paused in the hallway and pressed a small folded piece of paper into my palm. On it she had scrawled 2 words and a number. "Call me before 8, it said in handwriting that read like a map. "I mean it," she added below, in a smaller slant. I kept the paper in my wallet, between receipts and a photo of my brother from last Christmas. It felt like a talisman, a small human thing promising there would be another conversation. The proposal at 4 a.m. had been startling, yes, but it had been the beginning of a longer negotiation about 2 people trying to find space for each other inside their lives. It had been, in its messy way, courageous. That's where I leave you tonight, at the edge of the beginning, with a paper tucked into my wallet and the memory of a knock that pulled sleep from my chest. There are more chapters to tell. How we learned to be careful, how we navigated the building's whispers, how she shifted the center of her life so ours could align. But those are stories for later, when the coffee is still hot and the toast is only slightly burnt. For now, the truth is simple. A woman knocked at my door at 4 in the morning and told me she wanted to be chosen. I answered. And that choice has been the slowest and best kind of work. That choice has been the slowest and best kind of work. The weeks after that night resembled a careful choreography. We made plans in pencil. We practiced saying things out loud that felt too formal for bedrooms, but too important to leave unspoken. How we'd handle gossip, what we'd tell friends, whether we'd fold our lives together or set 2 neat stacks beside each other. It was boring and sacred in equal measure. We set times for check-ins, familiar, slightly bureaucratic appointments where we would admit small jealousies or ask for clarifications. Call it adult romance if you like. To me it felt like building scaffolding that might one day hold a house. Adriana kept her distance in the ways that mattered. Her days still belonged to the public calendar, meetings, speeches, dinners where smiles had to be calibrated. But she began to lean toward quieter evenings. I learned to recognize the exhaustion that pressed down the lines at the corners of her eyes. The way she would walk into my kitchen and take off her shoes in a certain staged way that was not a pose, but a surrender. We celebrated small acts of being ordinary. When she showed up with a bag of groceries she could barely pronounce, I treated it like a coronation. When she burned toast again and shrugged, I offered my most unromantic compliment. That this, here, was the most honest thing she had shown me. There were moments when the public and private rubbed against each other with friction. Once, a woman who worked with Adriana waved as she passed our building with a film crew behind her. The cameras had the slow menace of attention. They made private life a potential headline. Adriana handled it the way she handled most shocks, precisely, and with a certain firmness that had been honed by presentations and press rooms. She leaned over me on the stoop and whispered, "Not tonight. Not ours." It was a statement meant to be both protective and final. We had to plan the tougher things too. She was candid about the power dynamics her work created. Even as a neighbor, as someone I'd run into in the laundry room, she occupied a platform in the city that made ordinary choices look like potential signals. We talked about perception and reality. We asked, would our relationship become something she'd codified to justify her choices, or something I wore like a medal? We agreed we didn't want performance. We wanted to be permitted to be small people without a press release. Her decision to step back from the front stage came slowly, like winter thawing into spring. She didn't announce a crisis. There was no dramatic resignation letter on her desk. There was a string of conversations with board members and confidants, and one longer conversation with me over takeout on a Tuesday evening when we had cheese on the kitchen counter and the lights dimmed to something forgiving. "I've been thinking about not being the person who has to be right in the room," she said, twisting a napkin between her fingers. "What if I became the person who prefers the room to be right for people?" It was the most corporate thing she'd ever said, and the most intimate. We spoke about how we would handle the workplace. She would transition to a consulting role that allowed for more margin, less spectacle. She would offer notice and help find a successor, and then, importantly, she would take the public hit. Fame, small or large, comes with expectations. She accepted that in stepping back, she would surrender something that had become part of her identity. I brought my own fears to the table. I worried about becoming the person who measured every affection against a balance sheet. I worried about being rescued when rescue wasn't wanted. I told her my past story, that the neat life after Jennifer had been a shelter and not always a home. She listened like she had learned to listen in public meetings, patiently, with a slight forward bend, like she was making room. The actual resignation process was not cinematic. There were spreadsheets and counsel and a few awkward conversations with people who'd been used to seeing a certain version of Adriana on stage. Some of them were gracious, some of them smelled of disappointment. She did not expect universal felicitation. She expected practical consequences. She expected curiosity and, perhaps, thinly veiled anger. She also expected relief. When she finally emailed me a simple line, "I start consulting next month. Would you like to celebrate?" I thought of the paper tucked into my wallet and the way a small piece of paper can anchor a life. We celebrated with coffee and the city's kind of quiet fireworks, a window that stayed open late, and a skyline that felt newly ours. Moving in together came later, not by one grand decision, but because our things faded toward each other on the shelf. It began with a plant she could not resist. It had been unloved on my sill, and a set of mismatched mugs that found themselves stacked on my counter. The first week she stayed over, for more nights than not, was the week the building's gossip machine found its small gear and started to whir. People noticed patterns. It was inevitable. We decided by a conversation after dinner to tell the neighbors who mattered. The woman in 3B who always brought forward-looking casseroles, the old couple who'd lived in the building longer than the new paint. We weren't trying to announce ourselves. We were trying to remove the sharpness of sudden surprise. The conversations were ordinary, and ordinary in the way that changes the world. Mrs. Alvarez brought over a lemon cake and a warning about loud music. Mr. Hargreaves from 2C offered to help with a leaky faucet because new couples need someone to check their pipes. A few people asked awkward, practical questions. How would we handle building events? Would we be bringing dates? Was this a marriage situation? We answered, as we had learned, like two people in a joint committee, honestly, slowly, and with an occasional laugh. Workplace complications, when they arrived, were resolved with transparency. Adriana disclosed the relationship early and offered recusal from certain decisions that intersected with people who could be affected. It was minor in the neighbor context, but she wanted to do it right. She had a way of setting a standard and then showing how messy the standard could be if it wasn't followed. That ethic rubbed off on me in the small, practical ways we kept a relationship honest. We didn't hide messages. We didn't let convenient explanations replace hard conversations. Living together taught us a lot about the tiny, daily logistics of love. There were fights, not bar fights, but the kind that sits in your chest and makes you stammer. Who does the dishes when two people are tired? Whose turn to take the trash when both of you have deadlines? Who gets the last piece of garlic bread on a Tuesday? We fought about curtains once. She wanted them heavier. I liked the light. She once fell asleep on the couch and snored in a way I hadn't known she could. I typed the sound into my mental archive as a strange new comfort. We argued about the thermostat in winter and made up with the ritual of sharing a blanket while we read separate books. She learned my rhythms, how I liked my calendars color-coded, how I needed 2 alarms to ensure I left for work on time. I learned her small acts of rebellion, how she would buy flowers on a Wednesday because Wednesday deserves something pretty. We invented little private rituals that had nothing to do with panels and everything to do with being near. On Sundays we would walk a certain loop by the river and eat a pastry from a stand that seemed to change ownership every few weeks. She made me pick my favorite chair and then insisted on placing a cushion there even though I grumbled. I started to like the cushion. There were tests of character too. Old patterns tried to reassert themselves. A past flame of hers sent a message that felt like a draft under the door. I read it and felt a metric of threat that was more about my own insecurity than about any real danger. Adriana, for her part, was candid. She answered the message in a manner that made me see the adult woman she had become. Firm, polite, not defensive. It was a demonstration that she had not chosen me because I filled some missing piece, but because she wanted a partner to hold certain things with. The months turned into a mosaic of small moments. We took a cooking class where we both burned the same dish and laughed until our sides ached. She impressed me at a friend's dinner by quietly resolving an argument between two people who had been shouting about C-suites and supply chains. I introduced her to my brother Ben as someone who did not need him to approve of me. Ben approved anyway, in his blunt, earthy way. Rebecca, who had been a steady friend from the beginning and who later sat with us while we sorted flower options, became a kind of chosen sister. She helped plan a modest party that felt less like a wedding rehearsal and more like a gathering for people who knew how to bring casseroles and stories. And then there was the kitchen, the place where the proposal finally arrived, in a way that felt exactly like us. The day it happened was ordinary in the way the most important days often are. Rain had been promised in a low, insistent weather report, and the sky obliged with a gray wash that made the city seem like it had been pulled tight with a cloth. We had spent the afternoon doing small domestic things. She had picked up a jar of olives on impulse. I had folded a pile of laundry that had been threatening to form its own ecosystem. I was at the counter, slicing bread for, of all things, toast, when she came up behind me and placed a hand on the small of my back. "I tried something new," she said, in that soft way that meant she had attempted to fix something but was unsure of the result. I turned and found her carrying the familiar shopping bag from the corner Italian place, the same place that had been part of our testing phase. She set 2 plates down and reached for the toaster like someone attempting an experiment. The bread had moisture from a rain-soaked day, and the toaster had moods. We were no strangers to charcoal edges in our kitchen. I remember the smell in that moment. Coffee cooling in the press, a faint citrus note from something she had left on the counter, the metallic tang of the toaster. The toast came out blacker than usual. She looked at it with a small, pained expression, like a person who has exposed the private seam of a joke. She held one piece up like an offering. "I did warn you," she said, which was both a joke and an admission. I smiled and took the piece because, by then, char, or no char, burnt toast had become a symbol of what we were building. We had already declared burnt toast, to be honest. As I bit into it, she moved around the counter and leaned in so close I could feel her breath, warm with the garlic she'd been chewing earlier. "What are you thinking?" she asked, an echo of the first date months ago when we both possessed the astonishment of surprise. I told her something that, in my mind, had been rehearsed in tiny, sensible ways, that I was thinking of the many small ways she had made my life different. She laughed then, as if embarrassed by how much she hoped I would say something grand. She reached into the shopping bag and drew out a small flat tin I had not noticed. My immediate reaction was the kind one allows for ordinary people: curiosity. Her hands trembled subtly when she opened it. Inside was a ring, modest and unpretentious. A small band with a tiny stone that didn't glitter like a headline, but instead refracted light in a way that felt private. "Do you remember that night?" she said, voice small enough that, had there been anyone else in the building, they would have thought us odd and perhaps a little theatrical. I did remember. The knock, the mascara, the emergency plea that had been both a plea and a dare. "I remember," I said. "I remember that you asked me for something big under heavy circumstances. I remember that you said you wanted someone who'd pick you up at 4 in the morning. She laughed at that, an airy, relieved sound, and then did the most unplanned thing. She sank down on one knee in front of the sink, not in a pose learned from a movie, but in a literal kneeling that said, "Please let me be small enough to ask." "Kneeling in the kitchen is so," I started, because we had agreed to be honest about spectacle. "So ridiculous?" she finished for me. "Yes, so utterly ridiculous that it might be perfect." She held the ring out with hands that did not hold ceremony but held intention. Her eyes were serious. "Will you marry me, properly this time? Will you marry me not because I knocked on your door at 4, but because I want to make the small, ordinary choices with you?" The air in the kitchen felt like a chamber where small things were amplified. In the corner, the plant we had rescued leaned toward the light. On the counter, a coffee mug steamed gently. I felt the weight of years in a way that wasn't heavy, but more like an accumulation of small stones that, when stacked, make a foundation. "Yes," I said, which felt both inadequate and exactly right. I said it more than once, and then we laughed, and she reached into the tin and closed the circle of her fingers around my hand. There was no band of gold preening like a trophy. The ring was simple and fit like a final small puzzle piece. It was not the end of anything but the initiation of a kind of continuing. We ate the rest of the burnt toast as if it were manna. We sat at the table and planned a small ceremony. Friends, family, minimal fuss. She asked if I wanted something official, something with vows we could practice. I said yes, and we both chuckled because the idea of practicing vows felt like we were training for an intimacy that would, like any muscle, need strengthening. The wedding was the kind of quiet event that people tell stories about years later, because of how true it felt, not because of the lavishness of what was served. We invited 30 people, family and friends and neighbors who had been generous in small ways. Rebecca did bouquets like someone who always believed that flowers could transform a room. Ben stood at my side and kept his speech brief, which in his case was eloquent. We exchanged vows under a string of bare bulbs in the backyard of the community garden, and I remember promising, in a voice that was steadier than I felt, to be present in the small things, to fold towels his way, to put the kettle on if she asked, to speak honestly when it was hard. She promised, with a firmness that had always been part of her, to be brave in private and to protect the smallness we had found. We did not promise to solve each other's loneliness as if it were a single deliverable. We promised instead to notice it when it arrived and to sit with one another through it. We insisted on that language because we had both been tempered by past mistakes. My own retreat into routines, and her own temptation to make private life into a public brand. We built vows that allowed for growth and, importantly, for being wrong. After the small ceremony, we stood on the stoop of our building and counted the stars that, in a city, are the stubborn ones that show up anyway. Mrs. Alvarez pressed a slice of lemon cake into my hand and said teasingly, "Keep him fed." Mr. Hargreaves offered to fix the toilet in exchange for being first in line for Saturday pancakes. It was absurd and tender. The years since have not been a fairy tale, and I say that with gratitude. Things still go wrong. Toast burns. Arguments flare about the placement of the recycling bin. The plant once nearly died because we both forgot to water it during a holiday. She still goes to events and sometimes steps into a room and returns with the tired look of someone who has spent an evening performing altruism. I still catalog my feelings like an accountant. There's an old habit that behaves like second nature. We push on each other in ways good and hard. We test boundaries and sometimes find each other's edges. There have been moments of real grief. Her mother got sick a few years after our marriage, and the hospital waiting rooms taught us an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance. My brother had a rough patch where he needed help, and I learned to step out of my neat life to be messy in the best way. Those seasons taught us how little rescue can accomplish compared with ordinary presence. We learned to sit with each other's sorrow without inventing immediate solutions. We also learned to have rituals. On the anniversary of the first knock, because we are sentimental and slightly ridiculous in private, we reenact the moment. Only now it's choreographed between us. I sleep very poorly on that night. I pretend to be surprised when, at 4 a.m., a soft knock comes at the door. When I open it, there is Adriana in slippers, hair slightly askew, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and a folded scrap of paper. It's how she announces our weekend plans now. Sometimes she drops a silly note in my wallet, an updated list of things she likes about me in fine print. We do it not to cling to the rawness of the first night, but to remember the audacity of asking and the wisdom of listening. When people ask me how it happened, how a neighbor at 4 a.m. who proposed in a kind of panic becomes the person who keeps your socks where you can find them, I try to tell them the true, boring answer. Kindness wedded to caution. Moments of enormous vulnerability answered not by grand gestures, but by steady, repeatable choices. We did not let the narrative of rescue determine our roles. We were not each other's fix. We were each other's choice. If there is a moral in the tale, it is not the tidy kind that gets printed on a mug. It is that human beings can be both public personas and private unspooling, 2 things that can exist in the same body without cancellation. It is that a knock in the middle of the night might be an alarm, or might be someone needing to be seen. It is that the right way to answer the door is both to open it and to ask, with clear eyes, what will come after. I keep the paper she gave me the second time she stayed. It reads, "Call me before 8. It's now a faded talisman in my wallet that reminds me of an earlier bravery. The ring we use for everyday life is scratched along one edge. The scratches are like a map of all the little things that wear a life into solidity. We joke about the dramatic moment, but we honor the rust of daily care. In a world that tries to package people into images, we've chosen to go home alone together. So when I tell strangers that my neighbor woke me up at 4 a.m. and proposed marriage to me, I always mean both things. The first proposal, an urgent plea in the dark, was real. It startled me, and it started us. But the reason it survived is that what came after was not a single decision, but 100 of them. Coffee at dawn, a resignation that rebalanced power, honest conversations about privacy and gossip, burnt toast accepted as a ritual of truth, and the willingness to both ask and to be asked for what matters. If you have a moment like that in your life, if a small kindness changed the trajectory of your days, please tell me in the comments. I like to collect stories that sound ordinary and end up miraculous in the way people care for one another. And if you've enjoyed this, consider tapping like or follow. It helps stories like this find their way to other quiet mornings. For now, there's a knock at the door. The ordinary kind, 3 measured raps. And when I open it, Adriana stands there with a towel in her hand and a note tucked under her thumb. It's 4 a.m., and she grins at me like someone who still believes in being brave in ridiculous ways. "Coffee?" she asks. "Always," I say. She holds out a cup, and we drink together in the kitchen, where small things remain the truest measure of our choosing.